comes to attacks, violence, or killings of journalists, what I have noted is one, a reluctance of police around the world to investigate properly. And what do I mean by investigate properly? I mean that they take into account the work done by the journalist to understand the motivation behind the attacks or the killings. In my view, an effective investigation into act of violence against a journalist demand that the investigators understand and focus on the reporting, on the work done by the journalist, because it is very likely to be the motivation behind the attack. But most investigators are reluctant to do that, either because they don't know how to do it or because they don't want to do it. So that is the first issue. The second issue is a more systemic issue. In many countries of the world, any violence, act of violence are not very well investigated. So the whether it's a domestic violence or an act of criminal violence, the police may be overwhelmed, may be overstretched, may be corrupt, and so act of violence against journalists will fall within the general situation of very poor policing and response to those acts. So all of the two scenarios, lack of focus on the work of the journalist, plus a systemic problem of poor capacities within the police or corrupt police, means that when it goes to court, if it goes to court, a case is very likely not to bring justice because the prosecutor will not have sufficient evidence to be able to carry forward the case. So that, to my mind, explains largely the very high rate of impunity, a specific problem to journalists and a systemic problem. There is a third issue, which is quite specific to killings or violence against journalists, which is that in many cases, the person committing the act of violence is a hitman, has been paid to do that, and is not the person who ordered the killing or the act of violence. And so you may be in situations where the hitman may be identified because the material evidence is there. They may have left behind their DNA, or they may have left behind their finger analysis. But the police will be very likely not to be able to identify the mastermind. And that is the third problem with killings of journalists or act of violence against journalists, which is the mastermind, who are arguably the one we should really go for, are very difficult to identify. The hitman may not know who ordered the killing. There is no material evidence, direct evidence, linking the crime to the mastermind. And they have been very smart often, and they've used a lot of intermediaries. So it's quite difficult to reach to who is ultimately responsible for ordering the killing or the act of violence. So that, to me, is what we need to, it's a situation, and it is what we need to fight against. Of the three problems, the first one is the one that I think we can progress things. By that I mean, we should be able to either train the police or to instill in the police an appreciation of the fact that the motivation behind the killing of a journalist is very likely to be the work of the journalist. It's not very difficult to understand. I suspect the police will be prepared to hear that, but they may need help in terms of tracing in the report done by the journalist the sources of the violence. The other two problems, the systemic problem, you know, it's a huge one. I mean, it's the same for everybody, journalists, you know, the shopkeepers, the child, and so on. I mean, there is a systemic problem of impunity around the world, and you know that is the most difficult, intractable one to tackle. And then looking for the mastermind, that's technically very complex, and it you know, it does require a very experienced police. It requires a mixture of skills, because it's not just collecting evidence in the crime scene, it's being able to trace phone call, to look at a range of financial banking issues, to trace the money and so on. So, you know, identifying the mastermind, which is key, is technically difficult. That has been my experience, at least thus far, not impossible. And when material evidence is not there, circumstantial evidence can often be enough to at least charge somebody, a mastermind.